From downtown Decatur, it's the Faber Files. Hello, I'm your host, Bill Faber. Because democracy demands debate, we present this program on public access TV to cover issues and interests of the Decatur community. Tonight, we present part one of a very special one-act, one-man play written by attorney Kevin Bree of Chicago, a trial lawyer and an author and an actor who will present the life and reflections of probably the most famous lawyer in American history, Clarence Darrow. Join me tonight in part one of Clarence Darrow, A Reflection and a Life. I think you'll enjoy it. We're here with Kevin Bree at the Wildflower Cafe here in Decatur, and Kevin has put together a one-man play written himself about Clarence Darrow. Why is Clarence Darrow relevant for today?
It's fascinating. The issues that he was most involved with and the things that he cared most about are still relevant today. Crime and criminality issues and how we treat criminals is still a huge part of our criminal justice system. Obviously, the evolution versus creation theory keeps coming back every generation or two. New controversies, but it's an old issue.
It's hard to believe that the issues that Clarence Darrow fought for at the turn of the century are still with us today, as you say, evolution, criminal justice system, voting rights.
Absolutely. Union issues in terms of their relation to management and to work issues, big issues that are eternal.
Clarence Darrow started his career off as a railroad lawyer like Abraham Lincoln. Then he became a labor lawyer and then a criminal lawyer.
Exactly. That's the basic progression, although throughout his career he always practiced different areas, because even when he worked for government or for a large corporation, the railroad, he still typically had the rights to do his own kinds of cases and have non-conflicting cases of his own. So he was always a generalist.
What was the most revealing thing that you found out in your research and your work with this character, Clarence Darrow?
Well, like much of your audience, I had been exposed to Clarence Darrow through the movies, like Inherit the Wind and some others. And there's a very romantic notion of him portrayed in those movies, and some of that's true. But the movies and the drama and even the literature about him very rarely tapped into the real flawed human being that was there. Like many great people, he had great flaws too. And seeing those flaws and the ways that he overcame them really was moving to me. And it was something I learned that was new and that I incorporate into the show quite a bit.
Well, we're really excited to hear and see your performance this evening. You come very highly recommended. We're so glad that you could come to our town of Decatur, Kevin.
Thanks, Bill. It's an honor. If I had chosen to be born, I probably should not have selected Kinsman, Ohio for that honor. Instead, I would have started in a hard and noisy city where the crowd surged back and forth as if they knew where they were going and why. A city like Chicago. Both of my parents had English ancestry. My grandfathers came further west in this country than they started. They were poor and obscure, I'm sure, else they would have stayed put. But luckily for me, they each had a child, and these two later met and decided to have more children and were pretty good at it. I was never fond of my first name, Clarence. The one satisfaction I have had in connection with this cross my parents adorned me with was that the boys could never think of any nickname half so inane. I suppose I had reason to be proud of my middle name, Seward, as I was named after a great man, William Seward, Later, Abraham Lincoln, Secretary of State, a staunch abolitionist. Later in my life, my friends came to call me Mr. D, Darrow, sometimes CD, but never Clarence. My name is Kevin Bride, and I'm so happy to see you here this evening. I'm a good friend of Susan O'Neill, who was here, and I was with her earlier today, and I said to her, are all the people in Decatur as nice as the ones that you've introduced me to, or just your friends? She assured me it was probably just her friends. But I do believe that all the people are here are very nice, and I'm very happy to be here to meet you all. I once saw a show, or I should say I saw a DVD of a show, where the performer, respected British actor and director Simon Callow, spoke of theater as a kind of living biography. According to Callow, and by the way, that is Simon Callow, not Simon Cowell of X Factor of American Idol fame. But according to Callow, who chose Charles Dickens as his character and subject, this approach featured an actor, Mr. Callow, offering his views and opinions on the subject, Dickens, and furthermore, impersonating the subject and acting out the characters which Dickens, a writer, had created. I was greatly drawn to this kind of performance for a number of reasons. As an actor, I welcomed the opportunity to perform multiple characters, and particularly a well-known historical figure. As a writer and playwright, I had already created works which featured multiple points of view, from fictional to narrative to historical in the same work. And as a person, I welcomed the opportunity to directly share my views with an audience. So I stand here before you tonight as an actor, as a writer, and just as a person. And as to this latter, I stand here before you as an attorney. That's something I've been for over 20 years now. And this is of vital importance, since the subject of tonight's living biography is Clarence Darrow, widely regarded as the greatest lawyer in American history. Clarence Darrow had presided over numerous trials of the century in the 1900s. Clarence Darrow, who wrote many volumes of non-legal work, and in his time was considered the greatest lecturer in the country, coming along after Mark Twain. But this was at a time when this was still a very well-known form of celebrity. It occurred to me I might have some things to say about the law in Clarence Darrow. So without further explanation, let me tell you about Clarence Darrow, his personal trials and tribulations, the great legal cases, and his impact on the law and society. That impact began when Clarence Seward Darrow was born April 18, 1857, the fifth child of Amiris and Emily Darrow. He was born in Kinsman, Ohio, a town of about 400 inhabitants. Ohio was conservative and religious territory at the time, still is in many areas. But his family was quite unusual and quite progressive. His parents were fierce abolitionists of a Unitarian bent, and they regularly housed abolition movement leaders. His father, who had studied both theology and law, but given up on each, was a furniture maker and part-time undertaker who made time to read the New York Times. His mother was an early advocate for women's suffrage, and she ran a large family on not a lot of money. My father was the village infidel and gradually came to glory in his reputation. I cannot recall that I ever had any doubt he was right. My parents were great lovers of books, and our household was full of them despite the fact that we were relatively poor. But although my parents were independent people, the household atmosphere, like many at the time, was somewhat stern and formal. I remember a time my father came to school to hear myself and the other boys give prepared speeches. That evening he went on and on about one of the other boys, talking about what a great job he'd done and how he'd probably grow up and make his mark upon the world. I would have given everything I possessed if he'd said that about me. But my father said not a single word. As a child, I helped out my father in his furniture shop. Oh, but I didn't like the back part of the shop where the coffins were stacked. I used to imagine such things about the weight and waiting grave. As a boy, I saw the young men of Northeast Ohio march off to save the Union. All the singing and elation. It was a different mood entirely when they came back in boxes, just the kind my father made, stored in the shed. The waiting grave was impatient for my mother and took her when I was just 15. I admired much about the woman, but I cannot recall a single time she ever gave me a kiss or a caress. I often wished I told her I loved her. She knew, I suppose. But life had its enjoyments. For instance, every time there was a lawsuit, I would run down to the justice of the peace's shop. He was a blacksmith during the daytime. And I would watch those country pettifoggers abuse each other. Oh, they abused each other and the witnesses so violently and talked so much, I thought there was nothing I would rather be than a lawyer. Chief among my enjoyments was playing baseball, my one unalloyed joy in life. While Darrell was a reluctant student, he engaged in many philosophical and intellectual discussions at home with his parents. In addition to helping his father in the furniture business, for one summer he took a job working on a farm, but he was not a fan of manual labor. CD was not. After an undistinguished year at a college prep school, he left and he took a job for a few years as a grade school teacher, but he appears to have been as undemanding a teacher as he had been underachieving a student. He took to studying legal text, and in his spare time, at his father's prompting, he enrolled at the University of Michigan Law School. Like his father, he left after a year, but unlike his father, he followed up and worked as a lawyer's apprentice. And as in those days a law degree was still not required, he passed his oral examinations and at the age of 21 became a member of the bar. He married a local girl and started his practice in a nearby town in Northeast Ohio. He had a country practice, which is to say he handled the kinds of cases which were common to farmers and small town residents, such as boundary disputes or contest over the ownership of a cow or defending a people who had been alleged to water down a cow's milk. One case where his client was a young man who took care of an older man for the promised payment of a harness with a value of some $15. He took all the way to the Ohio Supreme Court after multiple reversals and new trials. And he handled all the costs, and he did it for free the rest of the way. This was a trait that Darrell was to exhibit his entire career, willingness to take a case on principle, follow it through to the highest court. He became a member of the local Democratic Party, which was a minority party, and he was elected unopposed to a county solicitor position, which brought a small income and allowed him to develop his law practice. He began to make speeches, as in the 19th century, this was a very common way for individuals to establish themselves. Speech making and debate were activities he engaged in his entire life. Darrell could have had a comfortable life in Ohio, but he became interested in urban issues such as conflicts between capital and labor and the treatment of the criminal class. He could see that the future of legal development and political power was going to be in the cities. The big city was calling, and it was natural that he should move with his wife and young son to Chicago, where two siblings, both teachers, had preceded him. I arrived in Chicago in 1887 at a fascinating time in the city's history, just a few years before the Great Columbian Exhibition, a few years after the famous Haymarket riots, which so polarized the city. Chicago at that time was in the midst of a huge population explosion. The city was barely able to provide services and protection to its citizens, by it doubled and more than tripled its population in my years there. Where there was violence and filth and such contention between the workers and the employers. But there were things that made it worthwhile. There were tall buildings going up. There was immigrants coming off the trains every day, there was cattle in the stockyards. Chicago had that wonderful power, which clings to it still, the power of inspiring everyone who touches it with absolute confidence in its greatness and strength. Oh, I was terribly lonely at first. I recall one time I stood at the busy intersection of State and Madison Streets for hours, with horse-drawn carriages quick-clockety going by and sign painters around. I stood there for hours looking for one familiar face, to no avail. But it didn't take me long to get acclimated. I did it by making speeches and introducing myself to influential individuals. I spoke on issues of crime, and I spoke advocating a single tax based on property ownership, and I got good enough at it that I started to get invited to meetings with larger crowds, which were covered by the press. One of the individuals I sought out became a powerful friend and mentor in my life, John Peter Altgeld. I had read some of Altgeld's progressive writings when I lived in Ohio, and he got me a job with the city of Chicago as a special assessment attorney. I advocated on behalf of the city in condemnation matters and road improvement matters, and within a short amount of time, the assistant corporation counsel resigned for political reasons, and I got that job. And then the corporation counsel, who was the head of the entire law department of the city, became ill and had to resign, and I became acting corporation counsel. I had nothing to do with most of the events leading to my rise. I certainly had nothing to do with sickness coming upon the corporation counsel. But while I did not make the corporation counsel sick, I am afraid I fully approved of it. His illness seems to be what they call an act of providence. If it was such an act, it is plain that Providence was thinking of me, not of him. Darrell learned in his time working for government that government just about always won in its disputes with individuals and small businesses. When a change of mayoral administration caused him to lose his position in the city, he more than landed on his feet. His friend Altgeld got him a position with the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, where he found that big business almost always won in its disputes with individuals and small businesses. These were lessons he never forgot, and later in his career he wouldn't hesitate to battle either big business or government. As his years as an insider equipped him to later represent outsiders. During his time with the city of Chicago and the railroad, he was really as much a politician as he was a lawyer. He was in close contact with the mayor and many city officials in the city. He served time in the Illinois legislature, and he helped manage Altgeld's campaigns for mayor and governor of Illinois, the latter successfully. In 1896, he even ran for Congress. But this was not a good year for Democrats. And on a ticket headed by William Jennings Bryan running for president, he lost and Altgeld lost his race for re-election to the governorship. He would have further contact with Bryan later in his career. During his years in the railroad's employ, he took advantage of his contract, which allowed him to practice law in non-conflicting cases of his own. But it soon became apparent that Darrell's political sympathies might start to conflict with his continuing to represent the railroad. He leaned strongly to the position of the unions. When the Pullman Railroad Company slashed wages but kept their rents in their company-owned town the same, a very divisive strike ensued, and Darrell, in a rather sudden about-face, left his job with the railroad and represented Debs. This was a really courageous move in many ways on Darrell's part, as many of his friends and peers thought that the unions, which had recently become legal, were far too radical to be trusted. So he lost some friends in a very well-paying job to take this position. After representing Debs successfully, he served as counsel for the miners in a well-known arbitration case which President Theodore Roosevelt had ordered, where he helped win numerous concessions for the miners. In 1906, he was retained to represent Big Bill Haywood, a mining union official charged with murdering the ex-governor of Idaho as retribution for the ex-governor's anti-union actions in office. It was a case which garnered national attention, the first of many for Darrow. He spent upwards 2 years out west defending Haywood. Darrow was never what you would call the glass of fashion in the courtroom. His clothes were often rumpled, and his hair was messy and intended to feature a neglected lock, which I have tried to recreate with some gel here. I don't know if you can see it. He was a large, lumbering man, but he had a great talent, among other things, of focusing on ideological and political questions rather than on the specific facts of the case. In the Haywood case, he gave the following closing argument, in part. If it please the court, gentlemen of the jury, nominally, William Haywood is on trial in this courtroom. There must be some nominal charge. That is it. The state has gone over a broader field, and as you know, the charge is considerably wider than that. It is true, there is an organization called the Western Federation of Miners. They formed this organization in 1893. It was an industrial organization, not a murder organization. The purpose was to organize the men who did the work so that they might have better wages, that they might have shorter hours, that they might have cleaner conditions and better machinery, that their widows and orphan children might be looked after. They did take some hand in politics. I hope we're not going to hang any organization for taking a hand in politics. If so, we'll probably have to get after pretty much every corporation in the United States. But this organization has never been involved in any criminal conspiracy in any unlawful act. I don't mean by that all of its members were angels. Angels don't work in the mines of them. They are the mine owners. Darrow continued listing the efforts and accomplishments of the union on behalf of its members and detailing the steps, political and otherwise, that the mine owners had taken against the union members. And he summed up as follows. Gentlemen, we will show you that Bill Haywood is not on trial in this court. But the mine owners have sent the defendants to Idaho, thinking that the conditions and the people were different here. They have sent them here, the mine owners, that they might try the Western Federation of Miners, that they might hang and convict and destroy it. And it is through this action that not just the miners, but all organizations, and not Bill Haywood, are placed on trial. In another case, he was retained to represent Thomas I. Kidd, who was a secretary of the Woodworkers Union. In that case, he not only focused on political and ideological questions, but he did so entirely at the expense of the facts of the case. You have heard a great deal of evidence as to whether Thomas I. Kidd provoked this strike. I don't care whether he did or did not. It is impossible to present this case without a broad survey of great questions which are facing the world today. For whatever its form, this is not a criminal case. It is but another episode in the great battle for human liberty, a battle which was commenced when the tyranny and oppression of man first caused him to impose on his fellows, and which will not end so long as the children of one father are compelled to toil to support the children of another in luxury and ease. The owner of the company in this case refused to collectively bargain with the workers. No, he preferred that they should come to him and petition him singly, like Oliver Twist in the almshouse holding out his soup bowl. The paint company may send these defendants to jail, but so long as injustice and inhumanity exist, So long as employers grow fat and powerful and rich through their robbery and greed. So long as they build their palaces from the unpaid labor of the serfs. So long as they rob childhood of its life and sunshine and joy. You will find other conspirators, thank God, that will take the place of these as fast as the doors of the jail shall close upon them. Gentlemen, the world may be dark, but it is not hopeless. Darrell won an acquittal for both Big Bill Haywood and Thomas I. Kidd. It was probably, since his reputation as America's leading legal champion of labor was solidified, it was probably a given that he would be retained to help two defendants in what was considered the first crime of the young century, the bombing of the Los Angeles Times building. You know, it's hard for us to imagine the great animosity which existed between labor and industry 100 or more years ago. The class-based hatred and warfare was a worldwide conflict, which in some places like Russia contributed to a violent revolution which changed the government and the way of life. Here it played out mostly peacefully in the labor movement, but not entirely. Business owners and those in management were not used to workers making demands and cutting into their profits. Union members were not used to the great power that they achieved when they worked together. Each side used propaganda and false information against the other. Each side resorted to occasional illegality and violence. At times, the state, local, and federal governments became involved, and both private citizens and businesses, including newspapers, felt strongly about the situation and took sides. People like Clarence Darrow felt that the ongoing dispute between labor and industry was akin to a second civil war. In the middle of the night, on October 1st, 1910, an explosion ripped through the building which housed the anti-union newspaper, the Los Angeles Times. 21 people, mostly working men trying to get out the next day's paper, were killed. This was an act of terror. And if you're looking for a recent occurrence which in some ways had the same kind of scope and national revilement, you could look to the Oklahoma City bombing in the 1990s. Homegrown terrorism it was, and through methods not entirely legal, two union members, John Joseph McNamara, who was a secretary of the Iron Workers, and his younger brother, printing union member Jim, were arrested and brought to California for trial. Darrow, however, had a huge problem.